Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and find yourself transported to Europe in the year 1000 AD. Don't get excited just yet, because statistics tell us that if we dropped 100 modern people back into the Dark Ages, at least 80 of them would be dead within 24 hours. I am not joking. They would actually die, and the variety of ways you could die would absolutely exceed your imagination. You might think, isn't it just living without phones and Wi-Fi? I can handle that. But the problem goes far beyond that simple. The Dark Ages are called dark, not only because of the loss of knowledge, but because it was one of the most brutal survival environments in human history. In that era, simply staying alive was an extreme sport that required professional skills. Let's start from the moment. Let's say you are lucky and didn't appear directly on a battlefield when you traveled, and you didn't fall into a cesspit either. You find yourself lying in a strange room surrounded by rough stone walls and a mouldy straw mattress. The first problem immediately presents itself. You need to use the bathroom. This sounds ridiculous, right? But this is actually your first life, or death test. Because in medieval Europe, the concept of bathroom is completely different from what you understand. If you are in a castle, congratulations, you can use a facility called a garderobe, which is basically a hole in the wall where your waste drops directly into the moat outside the castle or onto the ground below. But most likely you'll find yourself in an ordinary village. The toilet here is a wooden bucket, or simply a pile of straw in the corner of the house. Worse still, this bucket might only be emptied once a week, and the emptying method is simply dumping it onto the street. Yes, medieval streets were basically open sewers, mixed with human and animal excrement, rotting food scraps, and various disgusting things you couldn't even name. You carefully take care of your physiological needs, and now face the second problem. You want to wash your hands. But there is no faucet here, no soap, not even the concept of washing hands. Medieval people believed that frequent contact with water would open the pores of the skin, allowing diseases to invade the body. So their hygiene habit was to avoid bathing as much as possible. Some nobles only bathed 3 times in their entire lives: at birth, at marriage, and when their corpse was washed after. You might want to wipe your hands on your clothes, but when you look down at your clothes, you discover an even more terrifying fact. Your clothes are crawling with lice. Not 1 or 2, but hundreds or thousands. This was completely normal in medieval times. From kings to beggars, everyone had lice. And lice aren't just itchy. They're the main carriers of typhus, a disease with a 40% mortality rate. Medieval prisons were the most terrifying places you could imagine. This wasn't a place to hold criminals awaiting trial, but a place of punishment and torture. There were no beds inside, no toilet facilities, not even windows. Prisoners were locked in underground stone cells, keeping company with rats, lice, and their own excrement. But before you are pushed into prison, something lucky happens. A priest appears. He stops the guards and seems to be inquiring about your situation. The church in medieval times had the right of sanctuary and sometimes took in vagrants. This priest looks at you, says a few words in Latin, then gestures for you to follow him. You breathe a sigh of relief and follow the priest to the church. But you'll soon discover that the church's charity comes with a price. The priest brings you to a small room and gives you a small bowl of thin gruel and a cup of water. This is the first food you've gotten today. Although the gruel is very thin and tastes bad, you are so hungry you can't care anymore. You wolf it down, and then the priest indicates you should follow him to do some work. It turns out the church's taking you in isn't free. You need to repay with labour. You are brought to the back of the church, where there is a pile of excrement that needs cleaning. Yes, human feces. The church also needs periodic cleaning of cesspits, and this is one of the dirtiest and most exhausting jobs. You almost vomit, but you know if you refuse, you'll be thrown out. You have no choice but to steel yourself and start working. The danger of this work exceeds imagination. Feces contain large amounts of pathogens, including cholera vibrios, typhoid bacilli, and various parasites. Without protective gloves directly contacting these things, Infection is inevitable, and during the handling process, your hand gets a small cut. This small wound that would only need a band-aid in modern times could kill you in medieval times. Because there is no concept of disinfection, this wound will quickly become infected. Bacteria will enter your bloodstream through the wound, causing sepsis. Once it develops to that point, your mortality rate approaches 100%. At 3 in the afternoon, you finish this disgusting work, reeking of foul odour. You want to take a bath, but you are told no. The priest explains to you, through gestures, that water will open the pores and let demons enter the body. As an alternative, he gives you a rough cloth to wipe your body. This cloth itself is very dirty and might infect you with more bacteria. Now you smell as bad as other medieval people, which in a way makes you less conspicuous. But your physical condition is rapidly deteriorating. Long-term hunger, dehydration, overwork, and bacterial infection are taking effect. You feel dizzy, nauseous, and your muscles ache terribly. But the day isn't over yet. The priest indicates you can sleep in a corner of the church tonight. In exchange, you need to attend Vespers. You drag your exhausted body and follow others into the church, kneeling on the cold stone floor. Vespers last nearly 2 hours, conducted entirely in Latin, and you don't understand a single word. Your knees are numb from kneeling for so long, but you see others completely motionless, so you don't dare move either. Then you suddenly realize a terrible fact: your phone, wallet, Idaho, everything that could prove your modern identity is gone. Either it was lost during the time travel process, or it was stolen in the chaos. This means even if there was some way for you to return to modern times, you might not be able to find it. You are really trapped here. This thought makes you feel a wave of panic. Your breathing starts to become rapid, your heartbeat accelerates. But you must control yourself because any abnormal behavior will attract attention. Vespers finally end, and you follow others leaving the church. It is completely dark now, and medieval nights are truly dark. No street lights, no neon lights, not even moonlight, because today is overcast. The only light sources are the faint candlelight occasionally coming, but candles are luxury items. Most people can't afford them. Their nighttime lighting tool is something called rush lights, which are reed stalks coated with animal fat. These things produce large amounts of black smoke and stench when burning, and the brightness is very low, barely illuminating a small area. You are arranged to sleep in a corner of the church where some mouldy straw is laid out. But you quickly discover the straw is crawling with fleas, lice, and various other insects. They swarm onto your body in groups, biting your skin. Each bite could transmit disease, but you are helpless. More terrifyingly, you discover you are not alone. There are several other vagrants in the corner, and they look very sick. One person is coughing continuously, coughing up phlegm with blood. This is very likely a symptom of tuberculosis, an extremely common and highly contagious disease in medieval times. In such an enclosed space, your probability of infection is very high. Another person gives off a smell of decay. You force yourself to look and find he has a huge ulcer on his leg. The wound has suppurated, and you can even see wriggling maggots inside. In medieval times, such wounds couldn't be cured. This person will most likely die from gangrene or sepsis. But no one will isolate him because there is no concept of isolation here. You try to move away from them, but the space is too small. You huddle in the corner, feeling unprecedented fear and despair. It starts raining outside, and rainwater leaks in through cracks in the roof. Soon you are soaked. The wet and cold feeling makes you start shivering, but you have no blanket and no way to keep warm. At midnight, you finally fall asleep in extreme exhaustion, but soon you are awakened by severe pain. Your stomach starts cramping violently. That bowl of thin gruel or the water you drank must have had something wrong with it. You start having diarrhea, but there is no toilet. You can only take care of it in the corner. This makes you feel extremely ashamed and disgusted, but this is very normal in medieval times. Diarrhea is a minor problem in modern times, but in medieval times it was one of the major causes of death, because continuous diarrhea leads to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. And there is no intravenous fluid here, no oral rehydration salts, not even clean water to replenish. If diarrhea continues for more than a few days, you'll die from dehydration. Your body is getting weaker, and you start developing a fever. This is your immune system fighting the infection. But without fever, reducing medicine or antibiotics, you can only rely on your body to tough it out. And a modern person who grew up in air-conditioned rooms has an immune system that is not prepared at all to deal with the medieval bacterial environment. At 3 in the morning, you wake up in high fever and abdominal pain, your whole body breaking out in cold sweat. You know your situation is very bad, but you can't even call for help because you don't speak their language. You can only lie there, feeling your life force drain away bit by bit. At this time you hear a commotion outside. Someone is shouting, then running footsteps. You don't know what happened, but from the sounds it seems to be some kind of violent incident. In medieval times, nighttime was peak crime time, because darkness provided perfect cover for criminals. Robbery, murder, rape were all common occurrences, and they were rarely prosecuted. The commotion gradually subsides, but you can't sleep anymore. You start thinking about your situation. It is now your 18th hour after time traveling, and you've already experienced hunger, dehydration, bacterial infection, parasite invasion, potential infectious disease exposure, skin sunburn, muscle strain, hand wound infection, diarrhea, and high fever. Your survival probability is rapidly declining. But the worst isn't these physiological threats. The most terrifying is the psychological despair. You realize that even if you can survive today, tomorrow you'll face the same predicament. And there is no hope, no rescue, no one will come to help you. You can only rely on yourself, and you completely lack the ability to survive in this era. At 5 in the morning, the church bells ring, signaling the start of a new day. Others start getting up, preparing to go to morning prayers. You try to stand up, but find your legs are so weak you can't stand. High fever, dehydration, and malnutrition have seriously weakened your physical strength. You barely manage to stand up by supporting yourself against the wall, but you are very dizzy, and your vision goes black. You know you must find food and water, otherwise you really might not make it through today. But the problem is, yesterday the church gave you food in exchange for your labor. If you want to continue getting food, you must continue working. And in your current physical condition, you simply cannot do any physical labor. This is the cruelest reality of medieval times. If you can't work, you'll starve to death. No social security, no health insurance, no safety net whatsoever. In this era, a person's value. Once you lose the ability to work, you'll be abandoned to fend for yourself. You follow others to the church for morning prayers, but this time you can't hold on. While kneeling to pray, you suddenly faint. This wasn't uncommon in medieval times. People often fainted in church due to hunger or disease, but this will make you noticed, and people will start discussing what is wrong with you. An old woman comes over to check on you. She touches your forehead, then shakes her head. She says something to the others, then walks away. No one comes to help you because in this era, everyone is struggling for their own survival, with no extra energy to care for a stranger. And more importantly, disease was considered God's punishment. If you were sick, it must be because you had sinned, and God was punishing you. Helping someone being punished by God might invoke God's wrath, so most people would choose to stay away from the sick. You lie on the cold stone floor, your consciousness gradually fading. You start hallucinating, seeing phones, computers, cars, all those modern conveniences you took for granted, but have now lost forever. You think of modern hospitals with antibiotics, intravenous fluids, air conditioning and clean sheets. These most basic things in modern society seem as remote as heaven in medieval times. But reality is cruel. You are now lying on a dirty church floor, surrounded by indifferent strangers, with at least a dozen infections raging in your body, with no medical means to save you. Your immune system is fighting a battle doomed to fail against bacteria that have long been conquered by antibiotics in modern society. At 7 in the morning, exactly 25 hours after you time traveled, your body temperature reaches a dangerous height. Your brain starts to be damaged by the high fever. You can no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. You seem to see the priest come over, making the sign of the cross over you, muttering words. You don't know if he is praying for you or performing an exorcism. In this era, high fever was believed to be caused by bad humors or demons in the body. Treatment methods included bloodletting, letting the bad blood flow out, applying herbs. Most were ineffective, or performing exorcism rituals. None of these methods were truly effective, but people believed in them deeply. Your consciousness becomes increasingly blurred, breathing becomes difficult. Your body has already begun entering a state of multiple organ failure. First, the kidneys, due to severe dehydration. Your kidneys have stopped producing urine. Then the liver, unable to process the toxins accumulated in the blood. Finally, the heart, beginning to experience arrhythmia due to electrolyte imbalance. At exactly 8 in the morning, exactly 24 hours after you time traveled to medieval times, your heart stops beating. You've become one of the 80% of modern people who die on the first day. And ironically, what killed you wasn't the Black Death or smallpox unique to medieval times, but some ordinary infections that could be easily cured with a little antibiotics and fluids in modern society. Your body will be hastily buried in the public cemetery behind the church, together with thousands of nameless people. No tombstone, no ceremony, not even anyone remembering your name. In medieval times, death was so common that people had become numb to it. The death of a stranger wouldn't cause any ripples. But let's think about why a healthy modern person would die within just 24 hours. The answer is simple. We've become so adapted to the comfort and safety of modern society that we've completely lost the ability to survive in harsh environments. Our immune systems haven't been tested by the bacterial environment of medieval times. Our bodies haven't experienced that intensity of physical labor, and our psyche isn't prepared to face that kind of despair and cruelty. More importantly, we're used to having safety nets. In modern society, even if you lose your job, get sick, or encounter difficulties, there is always some system or institution that can help you. Social security, health insurance, relief agencies, charitable organizations, none of these existed in medieval times. In that era, you could only rely on yourself. And if you weren't strong enough or lucky enough, you would die. The reason medieval people could survive in that environment wasn't because they were stronger or smarter, but because they had been in that environment since birth. Their bodies gradually adapted to dirty water sources, rough food, and ubiquitous diseases. Their immune systems, after years of training, could fight against many pathogens that modern people couldn't resist. But even these native medieval people didn't live long. Average life expectancy was about 30 years, with infant mortality as high as 50%. Every family would lose more than half their children, and those who survived were mostly sick. Every few years there would be a famine or plague that took away a third or even more of the population. This is why that era was called the Dark Ages. Not only because of the regression of knowledge and civilization, but because of the cheapness of life and the universality of suffering. In that era, being alive was itself a miracle, and survival each day required paying a huge price. Now, let's understand some specific lethal factors in more depth. First, disease. Medieval times were paradise for various diseases because sanitary conditions were extremely poor, medical knowledge was extremely limited, and people knew nothing about disease transmission mechanisms. They didn't know about the existence of bacteria and viruses, believing diseases were caused by miasma, bad air, or God's punishment. The most famous was, of course, the Black Death, or Plague. During the Great Plague of the 14th century, Europe lost 1/3 to half of its population. But even during non-plague periods, plague never truly disappeared, with sporadic outbreaks every year. If you were unlucky and happened to travel to an area where plague was epidemic, your survival time might be only a few hours. Plague symptoms included high fever, swollen lymph nodes, forming so-called bubonic plague, and black necrotic patches appearing on the skin. This is where the name Black Death comes from. From infection to death usually only took 3 to 5 days, with a mortality rate of 60 to 90%. More terrifyingly was pneumonic plague, a form of plague that attacked the lungs, transmitted through droplets, with a mortality rate approaching 100%. But plague was only one of many deadly diseases. Smallpox was equally common in medieval times, with a mortality rate around 30%. Even survivors were left with permanent scars and possible blindness. Measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, each was a potential death sentence. There was another disease particularly prevalent in medieval times: leprosy. This disease caused skin ulceration and limb deformity, and was considered highly contagious, although actually not very contagious. Lepers were forcibly isolated, living in special villages outside cities, forced to wear special markings, and had to ring bells to warn when approaching healthy people. They were completely abandoned by society, living lives worse than death. Parasites were also a big problem. Almost every medieval person had parasites in their body, including roundworms, tapeworms, hookworms, etc. These parasites consumed the host's nutrition, leading to anemia and malnutrition. Severe parasitic infections could cause intestinal obstruction or even intestinal perforation, which was fatal in an era without surgery. Skin diseases were also extremely common. Scabies, ringworm, impetigo, almost everyone had some kind of skin problem. These diseases were not only uncomfortable, but could develop into more serious infections. And in an era without antibiotics, any skin break could become a lethal gateway. Then there were dental problems. The medieval diet, rough bread, lots of honey, plus complete lack of dental care led to extremely serious dental problems. Cavities, periodontitis, gum abscesses were all common, and tooth infections could spread to the jawbone or even the brain, causing fatal consequences. Many medieval people died from sepsis caused by tooth infections. Speaking of infections, we must understand that before the invention of antibiotics, any infection could be fatal. A small cut, if unfortunately infected with Staphylococcus aureus or Streptococcus, could develop into sepsis. Sepsis causes systemic inflammatory response, multiple organ failure, and death. In modern times, this can be easily treated with antibiotics, but in medieval times, it was an unsolvable death sentence. There was also a disease completely unfamiliar to modern people: scurvy. This was caused by lack of vitamin C, with symptoms including bleeding gums, old wounds reopening, joint pain, and eventual death. In winter, when fresh vegetables and fruits were completely scarce, scurvy became a serious problem. Many sailors died from scurvy during long voyages, but people on land were not immune either. Malaria was also common in certain areas, especially near swamps. This mosquito-transmitted disease caused recurring high fevers, chills, and weakness. While not necessarily fatal, it would seriously weaken patients' health, making them more susceptible to other diseases. Tuberculosis was probably the most prevalent chronic fatal disease in medieval times. This disease would slowly destroy the lungs, causing persistent coughing, coughing up blood, weight loss, and eventual death. Transmission was very easy because people lived in crowded spaces with no isolation measures. Entire families becoming infected with tuberculosis and dying one by one was very common. Besides disease, there were many other lethal threats. Malnutrition was a chronic but serious problem. The medieval diet mainly consisted of bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables. Meat was a luxury item. Most people could only eat it a few times a year. This monotonous diet lacked many essential nutrients, leading to various nutritional deficiencies. Lack of protein led to muscle atrophy and decreased immunity. Lack of vitamin caused night blindness. Lack of vitamin D, due to lack of sun exposure and proper diet, caused rickets, softening and deforming bones. Lack of iron caused anemia, making people weak and susceptible to infection. And food supply was extremely unstable. If the harvest was poor, famine would descend. During famines, people would eat things they wouldn't normally eat: tree bark, grass, even mud. These things not only had no nutrition but might be poisonous or contain parasites. Mortality during famines would skyrocket, not only because of hunger itself, but because malnutrition made people more susceptible to disease. Water pollution was another major lethal factor. Medieval towns and villages had no sewer systems. All waste was directly discharged into rivers or seeped into groundwater, and people drew drinking water from the same water sources. The result was severely polluted water sources, full of pathogenic bacteria. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were all waterborne diseases, extremely common in medieval times. Cholera could kill a healthy adult within hours through severe diarrhea causing dehydration. Typhoid caused persistent high fever and delirium, with a mortality rate around 20%. Dysentery caused bloody diarrhea and severe abdominal pain, especially fatal in children. Violence was also a threat that couldn't be ignored. Medieval times were an extremely violent era. War, brawls, robbery, murder were all part of daily life, and there was no effective police force. Crime basically went unpunished unless you harmed someone powerful. Even during relatively peaceful periods, violent death rates were high. People would fight when drunk, and fights often escalated into deadly brawls. Without medical aid, a seemingly minor head injury could be fatal. Knife and sword wounds that hit vital organs were basically death sentences because there was no surgery to repair them. For women, there was an additional lethal threat: childbirth. Childbirth in medieval times was extremely dangerous, with shockingly high maternal mortality rates. Difficult labor, hemorrhage, postpartum infection could all be fatal. And there was no caesarean section. If the fetal position was wrong, both mother and baby could die. Many women experienced multiple pregnancies during their childbearing years, each one a gamble with life. Accidents were also common: construction site accidents, agricultural labor injuries, fires, drowning. In an era without safety regulations or rescue systems, any accident could be fatal, and even just breaking a leg, if the fracture wasn't handled properly, and medieval medicine basically couldn't handle fractures correctly, could lead to permanent disability or death from infection. Fires were particularly dangerous because medieval buildings were mostly wooden, and people used open flames for lighting and heating. Once a fire started, an entire village could turn to ashes within hours, and there were no fire departments. People could only pass buckets of water in relay, very inefficiently. Many people died in fires, either burned to death or suffocated by smoke. Winter was a particularly deadly season. Without central heating or down jackets, people had to rely on crude stoves and thin clothes to get through harsh winters. Freezing to death was very common, especially for homeless people or the poor, and in winter food was scarce. Many people would starve to death before spring arrived. There was also a psychological threat: despair and madness. Living in a world full of suffering with no hope, many people's spirits would collapse. Depression was common in medieval times, though people didn't call it that. Suicide, though strictly forbidden by the church, still occurred from time to time, and some people would develop serious mental illness, believed to be possessed by demons, suffering exorcism, or worse treatment. For a modern person, suddenly time, traveling to medieval times, psychological pressure might be more lethal than physical threats. Imagine losing everything you are familiar with and depend on, trapped in a world you completely don't understand that is full of danger, with no hope of returning. This sense of despair could destroy a person's will to survive, and modern people are used to instant gratification and comfort. We can't tolerate even a bit of discomfort. Too hot, turn on AC. Too cold, turn on heat. Hungry, order takeout. Tired, lie on the sofa. But in medieval times, discomfort was the norm of life. You had to endure cold, heat, hunger, pain, stench, filth, with no way to relieve it. This continuous discomfort and stress would quickly weaken a person's physical and mental health. Your immune system would weaken due to stress, making you more susceptible to illness. Your judgment would be impaired by fatigue and malnutrition, making you more likely to make dangerous decisions. Your will to survive would fade due to despair, making you give up the struggle. Let's also talk about medieval medicine. Though calling it medicine is somewhat forced, because most treatments were not only ineffective but harmful. Medieval medical theory was based on the four humours theory, believing the human body consisted of four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that disease was caused by humoral imbalance. Based on this theory, the most common treatment was bloodletting. Doctors would use blades or leeches to extract large amounts of blood from patients, believing this could restore humoral balance. But actually, bloodletting made weak patients weaker, reducing their ability to resist disease. Many people died from treatment, rather than disease itself. Other common treatments included enemas, inducing vomiting, cauterization, and various herbs. Some herbs did have some medicinal effect, such as willow bark containing aspirin-like components, or certain antibacterial plants. But most herbs were ineffective, and some were even toxic, and dosage was completely based on experience and guesswork with no standardization. Surgery in medieval times was basically a death sentence. No anesthesia, no disinfection, no antibiotics. The surgical process was extremely painful. Patients usually needed to be held down by several strong men, and post-surgical infection rates approached 100% with very high mortality. Only in the most desperate situations would people resort to surgery, such as amputation to prevent gangrene from spreading. Dentists' work was basically tooth extraction, using tools similar to pliers. No anesthesia, the process was extremely painful, and the wound after extraction easily became infected, possibly leading to fatal consequences. Many people would rather endure toothache than have teeth pulled. Bone setters would attempt to handle fractures, but methods were crude. They would try to align broken bones, then fix them with wooden boards and cloth strips. But if alignment wasn't correct, bones would heal deformed, leading to permanent disability, and the fixing process might damage surrounding soft tissue, causing infection or necrosis. There was also a special type of medical practitioner, barber surgeons. Yes, barbers and surgeons were the same profession in medieval times. They not only cut hair and shaved, but also performed bloodletting, tooth extraction, and simple surgeries. These people usually had no formal medical training, relying entirely on apprenticeship and experience. Can you imagine having a barber perform surgery on you? For cases considered mental illness or demonic possession, treatments included exorcism rituals, prayer, fasting, or more extreme, trepanation. Yes, they would drill a hole in the patient's skull, believing this could let the demon escape. The survival rate of this surgery is imaginable, and medical services were expensive. Only the rich could afford doctors. Ordinary people, when sick, could only rely on folk remedies, prayer, or do nothing and leave it to fate. This is why disease mortality rates were much higher among the poor. Let's also consider lethal threats from social structure. Medieval times were a strict class society. Your social status was completely determined by birth, with almost no possibility of upward mobility. Society was divided into three estates: those who pray, clergy; those who fight, nobles; and those who work, peasants and craftsmen. As a suddenly appearing stranger, you had no social status. You didn't belong to any estate, had no rights. You were a rootless person with almost no legal protection. If someone hurt or killed you, they might not be punished, because you weren't anyone's property or subject. And if you accidentally offended someone powerful, the consequences could be fatal. Nobles had power of life and death over people on their land. If a noble thought you were disrespectful, or just didn't like you, he could punish you at will, even kill you, without any legal consequences. The church's power was even more omnipresent. Heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft. These charges could be placed on anyone, and it was almost impossible to defend against them. Trials were usually unjust. So-called evidence included gossip, forced confessions, or absurd trials by ordeal. Trials by ordeal included various cruel tests. For example, trial by fire, the accused had to walk 9 steps holding red, hot iron. If the wound healed after 3 days, it proved innocence. Or trial by water, the accused was tied up and thrown into water. If they sank, they were innocent, but might drown. If they floated, they were guilty and would be executed. Either way, you were dead. Punishments were also extremely cruel. Methods of execution included hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, being tied to a wheel, and having limbs broken with clubs, live burial, etc. And executions were usually public as warnings to others. People would gather to watch, even treating it as entertainment. The psychological impact of witnessing such violence regularly cannot be underestimated. Modern people are shielded from most violence. We see it in movies and video games, but it is not real. But in medieval times, violence was real and constant. Seeing people publicly tortured and executed, seeing dead bodies in the streets, seeing violence and cruelty every day would fundamentally change your psychology. This constant exposure to violence and death would either harden you or break you. And for a modern person suddenly thrown into this environment, it would likely be the latter. The psychological trauma of witnessing real violence, combined with the physical threats and the despair of being trapped, would be overwhelming. Let's also consider the issue of language and communication more deeply. Even if you spoke a modern European language, communicating in medieval times would be nearly impossible. Languages have changed dramatically over the centuries. Old English from the year 1000 is essentially a foreign language to modern English speakers. The same goes for French, German, and other languages. But beyond just vocabulary and grammar, there is the issue of concepts and worldview. Medieval people thought in fundamentally different ways. Their understanding of causation, their beliefs about how the world works, their entire conceptual framework was different. Even if you could somehow communicate, you would constantly be misunderstood. For example, if you tried to explain that diseases are caused by tiny organisms invisible to the eye, people would think you are insane. If you mentioned the Earth orbiting the Sun, you could be accused of heresy. Any knowledge from the modern world would mark you as strange and dangerous. And then there is body language and social customs. Medieval people had different ways of showing respect, different personal space expectations, different gestures and expressions. You would constantly be giving offense without meaning to, or misinterpreting others' intention. The concept of time was also different. Without clocks, people measured time by the sun and church bells. The idea of precise appointments or schedules didn't exist in the same way. The whole rhythm of life was different, tied to daylight, seasons, and agricultural cycles. Work in medieval times was also fundamentally different from modern work. There was no separation between work and home life. Most people worked where they lived. There were no weekends in the modern sense, though there were many religious holidays. The concept of career didn't exist. You did what your father did, with rare exceptions. Social relationships were also structured differently. Identity came from family, village, and lord, not from individual achievement. The idea of personal autonomy or individual rights didn't exist. You were defined by your relationships and obligations to others. All of this means that even if you somehow survived the physical threats, you would be psychologically adrift. You wouldn't understand how to function in this society. Every interaction would be fraught with potential misunderstanding and danger. The complete lack of privacy would also be deeply disturbing to a modern person. In medieval times, people lived in very close quarters. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. There were no locks on doors. The concept of personal space barely existed. This meant you could never truly relax or let your guard down. You would always be observed, always under scrutiny. Any strange behavior would be immediately noticed and commented on. For someone trying to hide their modern identity, this would be incredibly stressful. The role of religion in daily life would also be overwhelming. In modern times, for many people, religion is a personal choice and a private matter. But in medieval times, Christianity permeated every aspect of life. Church attendance was mandatory. Religious observances structured the day, the week, and the year. And it wasn't just outward observance. People genuinely believed in angels, demons, miracles, and divine intervention in a way that is hard for modern people to understand. The supernatural was real and present. This worldview shaped how people interpreted everything that happened. For a modern person, faking this level of religious fervor would be difficult, and any hint of skepticism or doubt could be extremely dangerous. Remember, this was an era when people were burned at the stake for heresy. Let's return to the timeline of your fatal 24 hours. By hour 20, you are lying on the church floor, barely conscious. Your body is shutting down, multiple organ systems are failing, your brain is being damaged by fever and lack of oxygen. In these final hours, you might experience moments of clarity mixed with delirium. You might see your life flash before your eyes, but it would be your modern life, now forever lost. Your family, your friends, your home, all unreachable. You might feel anger at the unfairness of it all. You did nothing wrong, you don't deserve this, but the universe doesn't care about fairness. You are just another person dying in an era when death was common and expected. Or you might feel a strange peace. The suffering will soon be over. In medieval times, death was often seen as a release, especially for those in pain. The church taught that this world was a vale of tears, and heaven was the true home. But most likely, you would just feel confusion and fear. Your modern mind, trained to expect medical intervention and rescue, wouldn't be able to accept that this is how it ends. Some part of you would keep expecting someone to save you right up until the end. The priest might administer last rites if he thinks you are Christian. This would involve confession, impossible since you don't speak the language, anointing with oil, and prayers for your soul. These rituals provided comfort to medieval people, but would likely mean nothing to you. And then, at hour 24, it is over. Your heart stops. Your brain shuts down. You are gone. Your body would be handled with little ceremony. No embalming, no elaborate funeral. You'd be wrapped in a simple shroud, or just your clothes and buried in a shallow grave. No coffin, those were expensive and reserved for the wealthy. The grave itself would likely be unmarked, or marked with a simple wooden cross that would rot away within years. In crowded church cemeteries, graves were often reused after a few years. Your bones would eventually be dug up and moved to a charnel house to make room for new burials. Any possessions you had would be taken by whoever found your body. Nothing would be wasted in medieval times. Even your clothes, despite being covered in your bodily fluids, would be cleaned and reused. And that is it. You would be forgotten. No one knew your name. No one knew where you came from. No one would remember you in a world where death was so common. One more dead stranger meant nothing. This is the brutal reality of the Dark Ages. Death was everywhere. Suffering was the norm. And for a modern person unprepared for this world, survival was nearly impossible. The miracle isn't that you died in 24 hours. The miracle is that anyone survived at all.